Mr. Speaker, this House had on two prior occasions raised separate motions on stepping up on our nation's efforts to tackle the climate emergency. Following these debates, the government announced revised targets for our long-term carbon footprint, peaking at 65 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions, or MTCO2e, over the next few years before tapering down to 60 MTCO2e by the end of the decade to achieve the net zero target by 2050. As a net energy importer, these are undeniably ambitious targets. Still, ensuring that our planet is livable in the future requires that we be bold in setting goals that are adhered to not only by our government, but also by our households and our businesses. Today, therefore, I wish to speak about our road toward decarbonization, but with an eye specifically for our nation's corporations. I'll speak about three related issues. First, I'll touch on why focusing on carbon emissions of the big players alone isn't quite good enough. Second, I'll discuss who we will need to train to ensure that our carbon transition efforts eventually succeed. And third, I will explain what role finance can play in all of this. I shall close with thoughts on why climate mitigation efforts need not, in fact, undermine business competitiveness. The current slate of policies aimed at decarbonization is comprehensive. In theory, this involves two major steps: decarbonizing energy production and electrifying industry, transport, and construction. In practice, this encompasses a diverse mix of policies: carbon taxes, energy efficiency standards and grants, shifting our transportation infrastructure toward electrification, and sourcing electricity from alternative sources, both in terms of energy type as well as geographically. While the government has appropriately taken the lead in these, we will only succeed when businesses are also aligned with the program. And this requires widespread buy-in by companies that, understandably, face a bottom line and are primarily responsive to their shareholders, who may or may not share the C-suite's enthusiasm for incorporating environmental goals. Ensuring that pro-environment sentiment is widely shared by companies and their shareholders is therefore crucial for success. Now, the bluntest measure for addressing emissions is our carbon tax. This was recently raised to $25 per megaton from a miserable 5% and will step up to $45 in 2026 before reaching a range of between 50 and 80 by 2030. While this remains below the preferred range for the Workers' Party, not least because it is still somewhat below the median in other advanced economies as well as the cost of carbon capture, we acquiesce to this increase, given how it is nevertheless superior to the original status quo. We have also spoken about how the tax could be adapted according to the contemporaneous state of the economy to allow firms some latitude to adapt to prevailing macroeconomic conditions. I had, moreover, previously explained why I believe a broad-based carbon tax is not only consistent with public finance principles, but also ensures psychological buy-in from all carbon generators. And to be clear, this would be everyone. I wish to return to this theme here in the context of businesses. In Singapore, the overwhelming majority, an estimated 4/5 of carbon emissions, are accounted for by just 50 facilities spread across manufacturing, power, water, and waste. While we may argue that this would largely absolve us from worrying too much about how the remaining companies contribute to emissions, I believe that this mindset is mistaken. This is because climate change is a global problem. And if corporations, including those that are not primary source emitters, fail to seriously consider their total carbon footprint, they may inadvertently outsource their midstream or downstream activities to other emitters without well-defined carbon action plans. Inattention to midstream activities such as electricity usage, raw material and equipment procurement, and commuting and travel policies could undermine the upstream efforts by their home country governments. Similarly, downstream choices by firms, decisions over their distribution network, or how they deal with end-of-life treatment of their products, all contribute toward the ultimate impact that corporations impose on the climate. This is becoming increasingly recognized by observers. It is no longer sufficient to pay attention to only so-called Scope 1 emissions, which are the sources an organization owns and controls directly. Scope 2 emissions, which are caused indirectly by a company based on where it chooses to buy its energy and how it uses it, also matter, as does Scope 3 emissions, which are those not covered by Scope 1 and 2, but are nevertheless created by a business's value chain. Responsible businesses are also getting on board. This includes more than 9 out of 10 Fortune 500 companies, and these standards have been road tested by diverse firms across the world, such as 3M, Acer, Airbus, Coca-Cola, Mitsubishi, Pfizer, and Shanghai Zidan. In Singapore, listed companies will be required to make mandatory climate-related disclosures consistent with the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, by 2025, and this will extend to large non-listed companies by 2027. This will include their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but only listed companies will be required to do so for Scope 3 emissions from 2026. Larger, non-listed firms are not expected to do so before 2029, which strikes me as an excessive amount of leeway. Shortening this timeline by a year, for instance, would ensure that they are held to the same standards and expectations as the locally listed firms. Doing so will also prevent Singapore from losing its competitive edge and status as a global exemplar of climate leadership. On its part, the public sector has appropriately stepped up. The government commenced its reporting effort in 2023 with the greengov.sg report. To complement this report, statutory boards will also publish annual environmental sustainability disclosures starting this fiscal year. Such disclosures will offer an important demonstration effect, showing not only what the government is doing to advance environmental sustainability, but also what is achievable by the private sector. Ultimately, a mandatory monitoring and reporting regime will require clear and uniform environmental, social, and governance, or ESG standards. This, in turn, calls for a whole set of green skills, the ability to perform corporate carbon accounting, manage firm assets with an eye toward sustainability, and provide reporting on the company's ESG impact. Such capabilities are key to Singapore's long-term survival and adaptability in a carbon-constrained world. But they are also presently scarce, a fact that has been repeatedly highlighted as important needs in the multiple editions of the Skills Demand for the Future Economy report. A Green Skills Committee was set up in 2023 under the auspices of the Ministry of Trade and Industry. The group, comprising representatives from government, unions, industry, and academia, placed their focus on two areas: clean energy and sustainability reporting. If we take this signal seriously, there will be a need to further ramp up training for companies so that they will be equipped to deliver their climate and sustainability reports at international standards. Similarly, there has to be a body of professional assurance providers that are prepared to audit these emissions reports. Institutions of higher education will be crucial to help fill this gap. The number of sustainability-related courses supported by Skills Future has almost doubled to nearly 500 in 2023, up from 250 in 2020. A quick search on the My Skills Future website lists 134 courses related to sustainability reporting, with the most affordable course starting at just $84 for eligible Singaporeans. And if this sounds like a marketing pitch, it's probably a good time for me to declare that I am, in fact, employed at a business school which offers such sustainability-related education. Still, impending compliance requirements will steadily accelerate the demand for skills in sustainable finance, carbon management, decarbonization, and sustainability risk assessment. These capabilities must be seen as central to Singapore's long-term survival and adaptability in a carbon-constrained world. Businesses need to be able to hire professionals with such tools and skills and afforded time to train and groom their existing workforce in acquiring green skills and competencies. A study by Arup and Oxford Economics estimates that there could be as many as 170,000 green-related jobs across all sectors by next year, although the government's own environmental services industry transformation map is more modest, pointing to 1,600 PMET jobs, the ones that are most likely to be filled by locals by this time. To further support upskilling and reskilling in the sector, the government can offer tax deductions or subsidies for employers with a clear training roadmap, in partnership with accredited or approved training providers. Of course, training providers must also be kept accountable, with education materials subject to checks for accuracy and subject to update and improvement. Such consistent review would be required to secure SkillsFuture accreditation. The Economic Development Board and Enterprise Singapore currently provides funding support for large companies to cover their first sustainability report, which have to be consistent with the International Sustainability Standard Board, or ISSB standards. But with over 600 listed companies in Singapore, all of whom will be required to make climate-related disclosures, they will have their work cut out for them. More can be done, however, for our small and medium enterprises, or SMEs. Workforce Singapore launched a career conversion program for sustainability professionals, or CCPS, in December 2022, aimed at supporting SMEs in their pursuit of sustainability. However, it remains unclear what the take-up rate for the proposed target of 200 CCPS professionals is, and how many of these will be operating out of SMEs. And unlike multinationals with substantial budgets that they can dedicate to fulfilling such objectives, as well as public reputations and reporting requirements to do so, SMEs are often forced to be selective about the aspects of sustainability that they wish to invest time and resources into. Direction on what such firms would focus on will undoubtedly be appreciated, and the government can work on a set of guidelines for priority targets. SMEs will also need to be able to plan for shifting regulations and community expectations, especially when they venture abroad. Smaller firms do not have the same capacity to tailor their market research to not only the traditional needs of consumers as well as cost constraints, but also environmental and regulatory considerations. Hence, Enterprise SG will need to expand its scope to also provide advisory and assistance on how SMEs can best embed sustainability into their overseas ventures. Now, just like how we cannot succeed in our climate mitigation efforts by focusing only on large firms, we likewise cannot expect to get to net zero by relying only on public sources of green financing. After all, our public expenditure needs are vast, and the investment gap that has to be met by companies adapting to higher carbon prices even larger. This is where ESG financing comes into the picture. There's already a burgeoning sustainable finance ecosystem in Singapore, with lending by both private sector financial institutions as well as public sector entities. Green, social, and sustainability loans have exploded to 30.4 billion last year from just 3.3 6 years ago, as have bonds rising from 1 to 7.4 billion over the same period. By 2030, the government and statutory boards are expected to issue green bonds that amount to 35 billion, up from 2.1 billion last year. Still, we should not allow the usual hype over ESG financing to eclipse some of the very real challenges on the ground. Some financiers have suggested that there is still insufficient reliable data on green projects to assure them that corporate actions do not merely account to greenwashing. This reprises the concern that I raised earlier about the need for high-quality standards for reporting and professionals. In the medium run, it may be worthwhile exploring whether subsidies for the green transition should always be directly channeled to businesses, or whether there's room to do so via responsible financial intermediaries who will be in a position to scrutinize business activities and ensure that they truly adhere to green best practices. Now, some have argued that sustainable projects must entail a so-called green premium, such that borrowing costs will be higher than the market rate for comparable brown opportunities, with the shift toward ESG-conscious investing implying that pollutive enterprises now face higher costs of capital, as perhaps they should if we expect to wean ourselves off such dirty technologies in the longer run. Yet, the evidence remains amply unclear as whether responsible investing must necessarily imply inferior returns. Mr. Speaker, I've offered 3 practical suggestions for how businesses in Singapore can embrace the carbon transition. First, we need to broaden the base for carbon taxation, both to include smaller players as well as stages higher and lower in a firm's value chain. Second, we have to monitor our progress with transparent reporting, which in turn has to be supplemented by workers with green skills. And finally, the financial sector must play a role in providing the funding to move things along, which they will only be able to do well if they have access to reliable ESG data. Allow me to close by addressing one of the most common knee-jerk fears to the pursuit of climate objectives, especially held by businesses, that it will raise costs and hence undermine competitiveness. This claim, while seemingly intuitive, is at best incomplete. While the explanations for why going green may not only be environmentally but also financially sustainable are both complex and multifaceted, the logic can be explained in a much more straightforward manner. Think about any kind of investment, whether it be in knowledge or the latest technology or even old school buildings and equipment. These investments always take time before they pay off. Businesses don't set aside earnings for R&D, AI, or capital expenditure for fun. They do it because they expect years, perhaps even decades down the road, they will be in a more profitable position with these investments than without. The same can be said for spending on sustainability and green technology. While it may sometimes seem like the money goes directly into a cost black hole, in reality, these are truly investments which will pay off more in the future. These may be direct. For example, over the past decade, solar and wind power have become cost competitive with fossil fuels, even without any financial support. They may also be indirect. After all, if irreversible climate change were to become entrenched, business costs will themselves be elevated by higher insurance and other business costs due to natural disasters, as we have observed in countries as diverse as Bangladesh, Mexico, Poland, Spain, and Thailand. And in the meantime, every old brown job that is being displaced means new jobs will also inevitably be created. While there's no sugarcoating how companies will have to dig into their pockets, at least in the near term, to decarbonize, in the future they will reap the benefits of their green investments, which will not only be better for their own bottom lines, but also for the only planet that we all inhabit too. And so long as we, as a society and economy, continue to direct technological change in favor of clean rather than dirty inputs, we will also be able to ultimately realize the dream of sustainable growth for our companies and communities and, of course, our children.